Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Back with us today is Stephan Kinsella. He's a patent attorney, and he's also a prominent libertarian who's been writing on issues of liberty for quite a long time. Stephan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks.
So last time Stephan was here, we were talking about intellectual property and we were laying the foundations for the discussion. We'll begin today. We'll do that a little bit to clear the foundations, and then we'll get into the IP stuff. So, Stephan, one thing, well, two things, and I'll get your take on both of them. The first thing is you said that property rights are not the right to use, but the right to exclude. And you also said that we have no right in things that are created, only things that are discovered or homesteaded. Is that accurate?
Well, you have a right in things that are created, but the right doesn't come from the fact of creation. It comes from homesteading or contract.
Okay.
And you don't have in general a right to something that's created. You have a right to ownership of scarce resources, which are things that there can be conflict over. The way you determine who owns these resources is by homesteading or original appropriation and by contract. So the act of creation is not why you own a thing. And in fact, the thing, I think it's proper to say the thing is not created. Nothing is created in terms of matter in the universe. Even Ayn Rand recognizes this. We just rearrange these things. So when we talk about creation or production, which is more of an economic concept, we have to be clear about what we mean. I think that what we mean is we produce things, we produce wealth, or we produce things of value by rearranging things that we already own. So that's why I try to keep those things separate and distinct.
Okay. So my first question is why, in your view, is our property rights the right to exclude and not the right to use? And what would even be the difference?
So you can word it the normal way, but then you get tangled up and it's less clear. So you could say that owning a thing. So property rights are rights in resources over which there can be conflict. So the whole purpose of property rights is to assign an owner of the thing so that outsiders know to avoid using those things without the permission of the owner. So that's what ownership rights are for. But then the question is, what's the nature of an ownership right? I think it's essentially a right to exclude, and the way you can see this is because owning a thing doesn't give you the right to do anything you want with it. Now, that is the common objectivist or libertarian way of phrasing it. You say that if you own your life or your body or other things, you can do whatever you want with these things as long as you don't hurt other people. So they sort of build into this right to use a limitation, and the limitation is as long as you don't hurt other people. But that's a little confusing in my view, because what's really being limited by this prohibition against hurting other people is your actions, because you can harm someone with your actions alone, even if you don't use an owned resource, or if you use a resource that you don't own. Like if I steal a gun or a knife from you and I use it to shoot someone else, the action that I'm performing is causing the invasion of the body of someone else that they own, contrary to their property right. So so owning a thing doesn't mean you have to do whatever you want with it. You can do whatever you want with it as long as you're not violating other people's rights. So then your permission is defined by other people's property rights, which is ultimately what property rights are. They're rights to exclude. So if someone else owns their body, the reason I can't shoot them with a gun or with a bullet from my gun is because they own their body, right? So likewise, my right to own my so their right to own their body is their right to exclude, to prevent you from using their body without their permission. They also have the right to allow you to use their body with their permission, to give permission to be shot or to be harmed, right? Or to be, like, if they give permission to a surgeon to perform surgery, they're consenting to the surgeon doing something with their body that the surgeon otherwise wouldn't have the right to do, because the owner of that body has the right to exclude. So that's what I think property rights are. It's the right to exclude. By the way, this is this is the nature of patent rights, which we'll get to shortly, which is a type of IP right. Most people don't understand this because it's sort of technical jargon or arcane, but a patent is not the right to perform or practice an invention. It's the right to stop other people from doing it. So, for example, it's the right to exclude, and that's because that's what the nature of property rights are. It's the right to prevent or to exclude people. For example, if I obtain a patent from the government, which I think is illegitimate, as we'll get to, but let's say the government grants me a patent on a three-legged stool, okay? Like I'm the first guy that invents the idea of a stool, which is basically a stool would be a seat member functionally attached to three leg members, right? For someone to sit on. So I would have a patent on that, which means I would be able to prevent people from making a stool, from selling, making, or using, or importing a stool. Now, let's suppose someone else says, hey, if I add a back to this stool and maybe add four legs for more stability, then this stool becomes what I call a chair, and I could get a patent on that, which we would call an improvement. And the patent would cover a seating device having a seat, four legs, and a back member. Now, that could also be patented because it's different than the stool. However, every element of the patent claims for the stool would be infringed by the chair, because the stool patent simply says a seat connected to three legs, but a chair has a seat and it has three legs. So that means the guy that invents the stool could get a patent on it, but he couldn't make the chair. I'm sorry, the guy that gets a patent on this chair could not make the chair because that would infringe the patent on the stool.
Okay.
So his right, he could stop the stool maker from making an improved stool with a back on it because he has a patent on that. So the right for the stool patent owner to make a stool would not mean he could improve his stool because that would be blocked by the other patent. But the guy that owns that patent couldn't make the chair without infringing the stool patent. So typically what they would do is they would cross license with each other and they would both give each other permission to so the stool patent owner would allow the chair maker to make his chair, which would include effectively a stool built into it, and usually vice versa. But the point is, if you say property rights are the right to use a resource, then you're stuck with saying, well, but except you can't use it to hurt someone else's property rights. So then that looks like a limitation on property rights, which then people will seize on to say, well, Kinsella, you say that the problem with IP rights is that it limits your ability to use your resource, like your factory. But all property rights are limited because all property rights really are limits on other people's property rights. So that's the problem with that way of looking at it. If you simply say property rights are the right to exclude, then I own a home or I own a factory, and I don't have the right to use it in any way I want because I can't use it to hurl rockets at your property or to take a gun that I own and shoot you without permission, because your property rights limit what actions I can perform. So if you simply look at property rights as the right to exclude people, then the fact that your rights in your body prevents me from using my gun the way I see fit is not a limitation on my property rights in my gun. It's just a limitation on my actions. So that's the reason I think we should look at it that way. In the end, it doesn't matter too much because you could word it the typical libertarian way, and you could say that everyone has a property right in resources they acquire justly, and this gives them the right to use it. But then you have to add the caveat, so long as they don't use it to invade the borders of other people's property.
So let me just give you an analogy that's probably pretty close. I look at rights as basically this. In ethics, I don't have the right to initiate force against somebody. So I look at rights in a sense as, in what situation would I have the right to use force? And it would be in defense. So to say I have a right to do something is similar to saying that I would have a right to use force if somebody tried to prevent me to do this.
I totally agree. I think that's ultimately what rights are. Rights are a statement about the permissibility of the use of force when the recipient of that force facially objects to it.
Right. So it can either be put as I have the right to use speech, I have the right to go, walk to the store or whatever. But the flip side is it means that if somebody tries to stop me physically, I have the right to retaliate. And it seems like a similar dynamic is at play here, where the traditional formulation of I have the right to do whatever I want as long as I don't violate the rights of others is the same thing as saying I have the right to exclude others from doing this.
I agree
It's
with all that, but the way I've thought about it over the years, I no longer believe that the right to be free from the initiation of force is primary. I think that's more of a shorthand description of more fundamental property rights. They imply each other. So, for example, if you say, I have the right to my body, to own my body, I'm a self-owner. That is the same thing as saying, uh, it's unjust for you to commit aggression, because aggression means using my body without my permission. But if you're not permitted to use my body without permission, that's only because I own my body. So there are different ways of saying the same thing.
okay.
Ownership of my body is the same thing as saying aggression is unjustified. The problem is the word aggression, if you just look at it, the way the word sounds and the meaning of it, it really means physical fighting, which implies physical clashing between people's bodies. But the problem is we expand the concept of rights in our bodies, which implies, again, aggression is not justified. We expand that concept of ownership of our bodies to other things that we own, like real property and movable property, like cars and food and homes and land. And when you say, and this is so Randians, objectivists, and libertarians would say that, well, if you use someone's home or their car without their permission, it's a type of stealing or a type of trespass. And then they call that, well, that's also an initiation of force, or that's aggression. But it really doesn't look like aggression because it's not aimed at someone's body. So the way I look at it is self-ownership is the prototype, body ownership is the prototype of ownership of other types of things. And we do call the invasion of self-ownership aggression, but it's sort of only by analogy or a stretch to extend that term, that concept of aggression, and say, okay, if I walk on someone's lawn at midnight when they're not even awake, and to retrieve my football, I'm committing trespass against this person. We call that aggression, but what we really mean is it's the unconsented to use of someone's resources that they own. So I think that's another reason to be careful about that word aggression. And again, I think that the only way to identify when something is aggression, except in the simple case like me hitting your body, where we assume each one owns their bodies, right? For anything else, like if I see two people fighting over a wallet, I don't know who's committing aggression because I don't know who owns the wallet. We need to know who owns the thing to determine when there's aggression. So if it looks like one person is beating another person and they're committing aggression, but what they're really doing is using justified force to defend themselves or to retrieve their stolen resource, then it's not aggression. So we can only determine whether an apparent act of aggression or an apparent act of trespass or theft, we can only determine if it's really theft or trespass once we determine who owns the thing in dispute. And we can only determine that, again, by adverting to the fundamental rights, the fundamental rules of resource ownership, which is original appropriation and contract. In a sense, those are the only two rules of property acquisition outside one's own body.
Okay.
It's original appropriation and contract.
So it sounds like you take the Rothbardian perspective, which I disagree on some points. I don't want to debate about it because we got to get into other things, but I just want to make it clear is that Rothbard held that all rights are property rights, including your right to your body, that's a property
Yes.
right or self-ownership. That's the position that you're coming from.
And I take that view, and I think, by the way, that's compatible with aspects of Rand's thought, because Ayn Rand said that we're not ghosts. We're material, physical beings, which is a recognition that, and she also said that, in Galt's speech, do you hear me? There's one thing no one may do. You may not use physical force. She used the word physical. She
Sure.
recognized that in the end, and all libertarians recognize this, in the end, all rights violations arise because of physical conflict between people and the use of violence. And violence is a physical action that can only be applied in the real world by the actions and motions of an acting human body against other physical things that can receive force. So you could imagine some kind of right to your reputation or your right to your soul, but these are ghostly, abstract things that don't really exist in a physical way. So all rights are property rights because all rights can be enforced. And again, the word, and this is compatible with objectivism, enforceability means physical force. So if you have a right to the integrity of your home or your body, that means you have the right to use physical force to repel an invader.
Okay.
And the invader can only use physical force to harm you. If they just shout at you, it's just like Jefferson in free speech. You know, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words cannot hurt me. If someone just has an opinion about you or says things, they're not invading the physical integrity of your body. This is why all property rights have to be, all rights are property rights, and all property rights are rights to control or to exclude the use of scarce resources. So yeah, that is my view. And I think
Okay.
it's compatible with objectivism, by the way.
So you've said, multiple times, you made the reference to man is not a ghost, that certainly is from Ayn Rand. And you said that right is right to the physical integrity of your property. And the only rights violations are physical aggression, physical assaults, that sort of thing. But to me, that negates the you're right that Rand says we are not ghosts, but she also says we are not just merely physical bodies, that we're an
Correct.
integration. There's no mind body dichotomy.
Sure.
So the source of rights, the reason human beings ultimately have rights, is because of our conceptual rational faculty, because we have to choose how to live. We don't come with a pre-programmed instinct on how to survive. We have to choose, we have to think, and that's a function of our minds. And I mean, to demonstrate that is fairly simple. I mean, there's a reason that crows don't have rights, or chimpanzees don't have rights. And I mean, I know the animals rights people may, oh yes they do, but they certainly don't have rights to property in the sense that human beings do. And the reason is because the base of rights, the foundation of rights, is the human consciousness. It's how it's the fact that we have to think, we have to choose in order to survive.
I don't strongly disagree with that. I do think you're sort of, and of course this is compatible with objectivism, you're blending together ethics and politics. From an ethical point of view or a moral point of view, as Rand pointed out, and I agree with her on this, the purpose of morals or ethics is to give acting human beings who have a complex consciousness and we have values, to give us a code, a guide to action, to know what is wrong and right to do. That's got nothing to do with rights and interpersonal things on a first level, because even Crusoe alone on his island would have some bare bones morality attached to his actions. If he wanted to
Sure.
live, right? If he wanted to live as a moral person and live a good life within the constraints of living without society and on this island, you could still say the virtues like thrift and
Oh, absolutely, I
all apply
agree.
to him. And you could even say if he commits suicide, maybe not suicide is being immoral, because as Rand said, that's a pre-moral choice, although I would disagree with her on that. But yeah, if he's lazy and he has a horrible month because he didn't save up, catch enough fish, that's you can say it's immoral because it's not what he ought to be doing to further his own life and to flourish within that context. But when society comes about and there's other people, then the domain of ethics becomes even richer, and there's interpersonal ethics.
Yeah.
Again, not even rights related, just whether it's moral or immoral or moral to treat other people certain ways, to value them, to view them in terms of justice, all this. And then a subset of all that type of morality would be rights. And rights are like, so I would say that morals are 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 optional in the sense that they're up to the person to decide whether to adopt or not. You could say someone's immoral if they don't, but they have
Right.
the they have the choice to choose to be lazy and to even be rude to other people.
Sure.
But what they don't have the right to do is to violate other people's rights. Those are the things that are musts, not shoulds.
Okay.
So that's how I view rights within that framework.
Now
But
you
still, I
just
think that's compatible with what I said earlier. Rights are property rights.
okay. So just a minute or so ago, you said rights have nothing to do with morality. What?
Well, what I meant was yeah, I wouldn't say it have nothing to do with it. You can view you are permitted. It is arguable that there is a moral aspect to rights, but I do think that logically they're separate. And here's the reason why. I said earlier in shorthand, I said that rights are a subset of morals. I actually think that's incorrect. Most libertarians would say that everything that's a rights violation is immoral, but not everything that's immoral is a rights violation, right? So
Yeah.
they view rights violations as a proper subset of morality.
Yeah.
But that implies that rights are a subset of morality, and that implies that every time you violate someone's rights, you're committing something immoral. I don't think that that's been established because now I do think that in most cases, in almost every case, violating a right is also immoral. But I don't think it's necessarily the case. And the reason is because you can imagine cases where you ought to violate someone's rights. Like if you have to break into a cabin in the woods, which would violate someone's property rights, you have to do that to save your child's life. You could see a selfish person saying, "Listen, I value my child's life more than the stranger's property rights. And
Sure.
so I'm going to do it and suffer the consequences and take the crime." So I don't think that it's necessarily the case. Now, I do think there's a connection. I do think that morality is a guide to conduct. And as part of that code of conduct, we need to know how to act with each other in terms of force. And we need to know which laws and which rights are justified according to rational argumentation.
Yeah. Well, the problem I have is you said earlier that I'm mixing politics and ethics, and then you said that rights have nothing to do with morality. You kind of clarified that and said
Yeah.
there's a loose connection, but the very concept of rights is an ethical political concept. It's defined as a just claim to something or a moral claim to something.
Well, I don't know. I mean, so that's
Without
debatable.
morality, there's no such thing as rights. I mean, that's what rights are. Unless you're coming up with a new idea of rights in divorcing them from that, but then you're using a word that's traditionally meant one thing
Right.
and using
Well,
it in a different way.
these terms have been used lots of ways, and I simply want to distinguish the concept of morality from the concept of justice and rights. They could be related. I think they are related, but they are different concepts. So
Well, morality is broader, certainly. It's like furniture. You know, all chairs are furniture, but there's furniture that aren't chairs. And morality covers more than
it is
justice and
broader,
rights.
but again, as I said, I'm not persuaded that rights are a subset of morality, but they're an intersecting set. And that's because I'm not sure that in every case that there's a rights violation, that the rights violation, the rights violator would be acting immorally. I'm
No,
not sure about that.
but morality it takes place in a context, right? And like you said earlier, that Rand says that suicide is a pre-moral choice, but that's not actually what she says. What she actually says is that there's some conditions under which it would be completely appropriate for somebody to commit suicide, and there's some situations in which it wouldn't. Context matters.
No, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, Ayn Rand, I'm talking about a kind of an esoteric point. Rand had to, like, I think Rand instinctively and intuitively, like you and I probably would say that a normal, healthy person in a normal context ought not commit suicide. They ought to live according to their, according to their full potential in their life, and that would not include committing suicide. But she had to admit, see, because Rand's ethics are ultimately hypothetical, and I think this may be in
Conditional. You've said
well,
hypothetical before, but they're not.
well,
It's
this I
not
think this
hypothetical. It's conditional, and there's a difference. There's a distinction. But the thing is, I apologize because I've kind of led us maybe a little astray, and I know you want to get to the IP stuff. I don't want to just argue about objectivist ethics. I just wanted to make the point that's not exactly what she said. And anybody that's watching, you can do your read OPAR or Google
no,
Rand's
I don't think it's I just think that Rand says that the source of morality is man's choice to live, right?
Yes.
And the choice, but the choice to live
Well,
cannot
it's
be
deeper than that though. It's not just his choice to live. It's the fact
as a
that we have
man.
to
Yeah,
make choices. The very fact that we don't come pre-programmed or with an automatic guidance on how to live necessitates that we discover and use a morality.
totally agree. But
Yeah.
the point is, when she said it's morality flows from the choice to live to live as a man, proper to his nature.
Sure.
This implies, and I believe she recognizes this. This implies that you couldn't have a moral criticism of someone's choice not to live, because you have to already have made the choice to live, which is what the reason I say hypothetical is this. All of Rand's,
Sure.
you could call it conditional, but all of Rand's moral strictures are based upon this fundamental choice to live, which itself has to be pre-moral or a. I can't. I think she said pre-moral,
She
but
says,
anyway.
she says it's a pre-moral choice. She does.
Right. Right.
And she also, I mean, it's not Rand, it's Leonard Peikoff in the endorsed course on objectivism talks about suicide and elaborates on it. But I want to
Okay.
sort of get back to this rights thing
Okay.
because outside of morality, the only rights you have, according to the way the word has been defined since at least Samuel Johnson, are if the government is creating positive rights or civil rights. But that's not how you're using the term. So outside of morality, you don't have rights. There's no. It's not just that they're somehow intersecting or connecting. Rights are literally the social implementation or the political implementation of moral. It's how human beings need to live in society.
I think that's it's fine to look at it that way. I don't strongly object to that.
Okay. So I want to move on a little bit to the value creation things because you've said that value two things. One is you don't have a right to the things that you've created and you don't have a right to value. And that's, I think, at the very core of your
Hmm.
critique of intellectual property. So can you explain exactly what you mean by that?
Right. And then if you want to chime in and give me where you think,
Sure.
where your perspective is. Um, First of all, the Randians use the word value in a sort of idiosyncratic way. They'll say that, the purpose of life, or one of the purposes in life, is to, have productive activity using our rationality according to our values, according to our nature, to produce or create values. Like they use the word values in the plural and like it's a noun. Like there's a thing that you're creating that's a value. But the Austrians would say, well, value is subjective in the sense, not subjective in the sense of arbitrary, like Rand criticizes with Kant, but subjective in the sense of being valued by the valuer. And value is not a thing that you can possess or own. It's more of an act of valuing, like demonstrated preference. So as Mises would look at it, when we act in the world, and again, this is compatible with rational action according to objectivism. When we act in the world, we find ourselves in a world of reality and scarcity, and we have certain values, and we seek to pursue those values by using scarce means of action to achieve those values. We pursue a given end. And when we do that, we demonstrate that we value the thing that we're choosing, that we're pursuing, and we demonstrate that we value the intermediate means because they help us achieve the end. So we value things. So it's a verb. It's not like a noun. We don't create values. We value things. And when we create, what we're doing is we're having successful human action to achieve an outcome that we value or that we prefer. And sometimes that output is not just a state of affairs. Like one output of my action might be just to achieve a state of affairs, and the state of affairs would be the end of my action. Like I might want to make my girlfriend happy, or I might want to see a movie that I've never seen, or I might want to go to Antarctica and see a sunset from there, something like that. I don't acquire ownership of something when I do those things. I have a successful action, but I don't acquire ownership of anything. It's a productive, successful action, but I don't do anything. Quite often, though, one subset of action is the acquisition or transformation of scarce resources. So if I prefer to have a hamburger, or if I prefer to have a car, One way to achieve that end would be to purchase it from someone, like to pay money or to perform a service. Someone gives me title to that car or to that hamburger. And now I have that. So the end of my action was to acquire the ownership and possession of this thing, which I've done. Another thing we could do is we could transform or produce by taking resources that are untransformed and transforming them into a better configuration, rearranging, as even Ayn Rand recognizes. We take existing matter that we own or that someone else owns, and we rearrange it with our effort, our mentality, our creativity, our labor into another shape, which gives us a more useful thing. That's how we create wealth and what you could call a value. You could say you're creating values, but what you're really doing is you're making an existing thing more useful to you or to someone else. That's how wealth and value, wealth emerges from productive activity of human beings. But what they're doing is they're using and manipulating existing resources to make them into a different shape. And then the only question is, who owns these things that were created or that were rearranged? And property rights answers that question, because property rights already specifies by contract and by original appropriation who owns these scarce resources. This is why, for example, Henry Ford, when he owns a factory making Model T cars, he employs workers, and they are, in a sense, helping to cooperate to produce the cars because they're using their effort, their labor, to transform the raw steel and the rubber and everything that it comes down the assembly line and produce new cars. But they don't own the cars. The Ford Corporation owns the cars, right? Because of contract between the people. In fact, this is part of the problem with Marxianism, right? And the idea that if Ford makes a profit, it can only be because the surplus labor value of the workers is being stolen from them or exploited because they own their labor. Because Marxians also buy into this labor theory of value, which is similar to the labor theory of property, which is at the root of intellectual property thinking. This idea that people own their bodies and therefore they own their actions or their labor as some kind of substance which exudes from their bodies and is mixed with these things and gives the transformed resource its value. And therefore there's some kind of connection between owning your body and then owning your labor and owning the resulting created value or thing. So it's all confused. You simply need to say everyone owns their body and they own resources that they acquired by contract or from the state of nature. And then however they rearrange them using their labor, the person who owns the outcome, the resulting product depends upon the contract. So if it's Henry Ford's workers, they don't own it because they didn't own the input factors. If I take some wood, some logs from a field that I acquire and I therefore homestead them and I own these logs and I use my labor to build a log cabin, I own the log cabin, but not because I created it. I own the log cabin because I already owned the field and the logs. Now, I have a log cabin because my effort rearranged these logs into a more useful configuration called a house or a cabin. Does that sort of do you understand where I'm coming from? Does that make sense?
I understand completely where you're coming from, and I think you're 100% wrong, and I'll tell you why. The first thing is that let me just start at the end where you said, and I'll give you my conclusion to what you said there, and then I want to go back. You said that you own the log cabin because you own the resources. I would say it's both. I'd say you own the log cabin, qua log cabin, because you own the resources that went into it and because you've created it. That's what I would say there. Now, as far as value goes, part of this confusion, and I've actually written about this in my book, part of the confusion comes from different senses in which the term value is used. It comes from Rand's, what I think is a bad definition of value. So, but let me just start with Mises. So Mises talks about how value is subjective, meaning that there's no intrinsic value in any object or anything in life. It's all a matter basically of personal opinion. But if Mises is right about that, that's why Mises held there can be no objective morality. And he also held there can be no rights. because without morality, you can't have rights. It's why he said that you can only judge things from the outcomes that you want. So he advocated capitalism. He would say, if you want prosperity, if you
Yeah.
want the greatest happiness for the greatest number, this is what you do. But he didn't pass a moral judgment on that.
No, I agree. He was a consequentialist. I
To
view
his
his
to
the
it to
structure of
his
his argument as similar to Rand's. They're both hypothetical in the sense of if you
well,
want this, you should do this.
okay, now there's a different there's so when it comes to economics, meaning prices, profits, those things are the result of subjective choices. They have nothing to do with the right or wrongness of the decisions. The price of a given product, my microphone, has to do with the value that the various participants in the market place on that microphone, buyers and sellers. So economic value in that sense is subjective in that it's the result of subjective decisions. Now, when you use value as a verb, like you said, it's true. There's a distinction between what I value and what actually has value. What has value is in the objective sense. The problem with Rand is Rand defined value as that which you seek to gain or keep.
Yeah.
I think that's a serious mistake because it implies that value is subjective. Whatever I happen to gain or keep, or seek to gain or keep is of value. But that's definitely not the case because she said life is the standard. What that means is that I can value the wrong thing. In other words, I can value something that doesn't have actual value as measured against what you agreed, my well-being, my long-term
Yeah.
well-being. I,
Yeah.
for instance, can value heroin. That doesn't mean heroin has value.
And I totally agree with that.
Yeah,
And I think
but
yeah.
value defined in the objective sense is any object or quality desirable as a means or ends in itself. That's a different sense of
I
value.
agree, but I don't agree with you about. So I think you're wrong about Mises. I think you're conflating. So I think Mises is perfectly correct to say that as a descriptive matter, value as an economic phenomenon is subjective, but that does not imply the subjectivity, the ethical subjectivity that Rand criticizes rightly. And it doesn't imply
But
it's not the
Mises
reason.
says so, Stefan.
Yeah, but
Mises
they're
says so. I mean, it's not. We're talking about Mises's view.
no, but
Mises actually. I mean, if morality is a code of values to guide human behavior, and values are all subjective, then morality necessarily is subjective. Mises says as much. I don't remember. I think he says it in Human
but
Action.
the,
I
but
don't have it in front of
yeah,
me,
but
but
I
that's
don't.
what his
But
position
okay,
is.
I don't. I mean, we'd have to look at Mises. I don't think Mises. That's not integral to Mises's views on economics. That was his political views. I think they're shaky. They're roughly common sense. They're roughly, they're hypothetical. You could pick apart his ethics. He never did write a lot about ethics. But I think his economic view is simply look. It's simply a fact. I mean, even Rand made this mistake to a degree. If you think it's a mistake, when she does define value as something that you act, and she added the word act to
To
gain
gain
and
or
or
keep.
keep.
I agree.
That's
Her
very
definition.
similar to the economic notion of demonstrated preference.
I don't disagree, and that's why I've critiqued her definition. I've done it both on this podcast, I've done it in writing, and I've done it when I've been interviewed elsewhere. But that doesn't negate the crux of her theory. That's
Right,
just a
but
poor definition within a much larger
yeah,
system.
and you and I probably see somewhat eye to eye on some of this, but I don't really think it is relevant. So how does that get you to? Okay, let me ask you one hypothetical. See if we can
Sure.
distinguish here. So I work for a company building log cabins.
Yes.
This and I go to two houses a day. I go to house one, house two, and I work with 10 other guys, and we get paid a salary, and we take these logs and we build log cabins. Now we are producing the log cabins with our labor and our effort. Why don't
Sure.
we own those? Why would you say is the simple reason we don't own the log cabins that we produce?
Because we didn't own the initial resources.
Exactly.
No, but you have to have, that's why I'm saying in the terms in the cabin, and I gave you the example, is it's both. It's the fact that I own the resources and created it. If you've been farmed out to create something for somebody else with their resources, you've agreed under contract to do that.
Right.
But
Yeah,
that's a different scenario
but you
than
would
if you do
agree.
it with your own resources.
Fine, but you would agree if I am a human being operating in the world and I have title to this tract of land and
Sure.
I own the trees on it, I already
Yeah.
own those things, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, now
Yeah.
if I build a log cabin, I would agree I've created something of value. I
Yep.
would agree. You could even say I've created of value. You could say I've increased my wealth.
Yes.
Now, but the reason I own the resulting house is completely explained by the fact that I already owned everything that went into it. You don't need to add the second thing. I own it because I own the lumber and I own what I create. You already own, in
But you
other words,
do own it. That's
you do,
what
of
I don't
course, yeah,
understand
you
because
own this matter that's on your land, and however it's arranged, you own it, and whatever you want to call it, you own it. That's true.
sure, but the problem here is that as we discussed earlier, if human consciousness is the source of rights, which you agreed it was, the nature
Well,
of
I
human
didn't say
consciousness.
consciousness, but
Well, the rational faculty, the fact that you have to choose, that's the human consciousness,
I don't think it's a
right?
source of rights. I'd say it's the reason why we can justify rights. But okay,
So now if I take my matter, I'm on my land and I take everything and I build a cabin.
yes,
I've added by the creative rational faculty that I have, I've added to the value that was previously there in just the
correct.
raw
That's you've
resources.
added what I call wealth. That's correct.
Yes.
You created wealth.
So you would not say that I don't have a right to that additional
I
value.
do. I do. You don't. No one has a right
So
to value. Value
okay,
is not
so
an
hold on.
ownable
Okay,
thing.
well here I have a hypothetical for you. If I built this log cabin, I take my raw resources and I rearrange them and I build a log cabin. So the value of the raw resources on the market, let's say, is $5,000.
Or hold on, or the value to you. Like now it's more useful to you. It's a more
Well,
useful thing.
it's useful to me, but there's also a market value of the product
There could
the
be.
logs, right? So now I rearrange them into a cabin that has a market value, say, of $200,000, right?
Okay.
If somebody were to knock down my cabin
Yes.
and leave all the raw resources are perfectly intact, just like they
Yes.
were before, right?
Yes.
You wouldn't just say, well, I don't know what you would say, but I wouldn't, that all they've done is trespass past my property and that's why it's a rights violation. They would owe me
No,
not
I
only
would.
you would say that they only owe you the value of
No,
the raw
no.
resources.
There's two things you're saying here. I would say that, yeah, the only thing they did was commit trespass against your property. They used it without your permission. That is
But
true. That's what
do
the,
they owe you now for the additional value that you added by means of your creation?
of course, but not because you own the value.
Well, then, so why would they owe you anything if not because you have a property right
Because
and a value?
the reason that we want there to be property rights, and the reason we object to property rights being invaded, the reason we oppose aggression is because it has an effect, because we're not ghosts, right? So if, for example, if you could destroy my log cabin and with a blink of an eye, I could conjure it back up again. In other words, if we lived in a world of no scarcity, then we wouldn't care if someone did it because they wouldn't be doing anything. The only reason that we care about an act of aggression is because it has an effect. And the effect is that it prevents the owner from using his resource as he sees fit. So if I want I don't know, let's take a better example. Let's say I'm a virgin teenage girl.
Hold that one thought right there, the
All right.
virgin scene, because I want to address what you just
All
said
right.
about the cabin.
All right.